Hi, everybody. It's me, Elizabeth Barrett, and I'm here to give a lunch and learn talk about making seasonal broths to enhance your health. But before I do that, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Hope everyone is doing well. I hope that you're staying well, and I hope that things are happy and stress-free as much as they can be. All right. So today's lunch and learn, we were talking about broth. And broth is kind of a big part of Chinese cuisine, especially in the southern China. And they use these broths to help acclimate themselves to the season, to the environment, and in doing so, to improve their health throughout the year. The idea is kind of like this, and here's a good quote for you. Spring is the time to start. Summer is the time for growth. Fall is the time for harvesting. And winter is the time for storage. So the idea is in each of those different seasons, you would have a different foods that you would eat, of course, and different broths that you might drink or that you different soups you might make with those broths. And that in doing so, you would acclimate yourself to what your body naturally wants to do for that season. Okay. So that's not a concept that is natural to us in the West. And it's a very interesting concept and it's a good concept. So I've been asked to talk about it. And what I'd like to start with is that I did a lot of research on this. There's some different opinions on how to acclimate, what foods are good, what things you would use as ingredients in the broths. And I am really just taking a distillation of what I've come up with that makes sense to me. And if you have something to add or some other questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Okay, so when you're making a seasonal broth, here's the things you want to consider. One, what is the seasonal environment? What's the energy or the chi of that season? Okay, now if you're familiar with any Eastern medicine cosmology or philosophy or medicine or anything like that, you might know the terms yin and yang. And on some level, you can simplify those a little bit. Um, and one of the most basic ways to look at it would be heat and cold. So cold would be more yin, heat would be more yang. Another way to simplify it would be dry or wet. Yin would tend to be more wet, yang would tend to be more dry. So yang, hot and dry, yin, cool and wet. Okay, so you want a balance within your body of yin and yang. And you want that balance ideally to reflect something that will balance you with your environment. So if the external environment is hot, then you would probably want to take in cooling foods in order to balance out the heat that you're getting externally. If the external environment tends to make you dry, then you would take in things that moisten you internally. Okay, so we'll talk more about what that would be. So the season and which seasons are going to have which climate depends, at least what time of the year that they're going to happen, depends a little bit on where you live, because not every place has very cold winters, not every place has very hot summers, not every place has all the different seasonal variations. And if you go from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, the timing for the summer versus the winter is going to reverse. Okay, so bearing that in mind, if we're talking about northern hemisphere, about a temperate climate with four seasons, generally speaking, spring is going to be January to March-ish in the Chinese calendar. And that springtime would be kind of a warmer time. And depending on your climate, it might be a little more wet. It might be more rain, or there might be a little bit of snow still going on. If you get to the summertime, summer in the Chinese calendar starts a little earlier than we would typically in the West. So it starts April, kind of goes through June-ish. And that time, fast growth, high energy, so it's going to be hotter and probably drier in that you tend to get dehydrated more during the summer when it's hot and you're out doing a lot. Okay. It's the most yang time of the year in the summer. So we said spring. Spring would be what they'd call yang within yin, meaning the warming element is rising and the cooling element is starting to fade from the winter. In the summer, we've got the full yang, the hottest time of the year. Okay, and then we get to fall, things start to cool down. So now we're getting the yin within yang, where the cooling aspect is starting to come up and be more present in the environment. So in the fall, which starts actually in the Chinese calendar, would start in July-ish and move on until September. Then that's maturity, harvest time, and it's cooler and gets drier. At least in my climate, it gets drier. If you have a rainy season in the fall, then you might have the opposite of that. Then we get to winter. Winter is October to December. And that's storage time, that's hibernation time, that's time when everybody is kind of slowing down. They're not doing as much. They're trying to store up energy for the coming spring. So that would be environmentally would be more cold. And if you get a lot of snow, it might be more on the wet side in the environment. So that wet, cold, kind of damp, cold, penetrating feeling. Okay. So what you would do with your broth then is try to counteract that. So the winter broth then, if it's cold and wet outside, then your broth is going to have ingredients that are warmer in energy. In other words, they produce warmth within your body. Things like ginger, things like garlic, things like onions, things like radishes, these kind of things. And things that also produce more, tend to dry you a little bit more so that you're resistant to that damp from the external environment. So the drying ingredients are not always things that are actually dry. Sometimes they're things that are a little warmer. Ginger could also be a drying ingredient, for example. Even if you're taking fresh ginger and it's not dried out, okay, because it has that drying effect. Um, Anything also that tends to counteract sweet flavor will tend to be considered a little bit drying. Okay, so those just for example. So if you know what the climate is, you kind of know what type of thing you're trying to put in your broth. All right, so our first consideration, the environment, season. Second consideration, your environment internally. What's your health like? Are you more on the yin side or the yang side? And there's different ways to tell. If you don't know anything really about how to diagnose that, one of the easier ways to diagnose it would be, well, if I'm in the room and everybody feels like it's a good normal temperature, do I feel hot relative to everyone else? Do I feel cold relative to everyone else? Do I tend to be warmer than the people around me? Do I tend to be cooler than the people around me? And if you tend to be warmer, then you're more yang. You have maybe more of a hot internal environment or a warm internal environment. If you tend to be cooler, then you're more yin. You tend to have more of a yin internal, cooler internal environment. Okay. Another way to diagnose a little bit about your internal condition would be to think about the seasons themselves and which seasons feel good and which seasons don't feel good. Do you feel like really good in the summer and you feel terrible in the winter? Because if you do, it might be that you like that external hot climate and the winter clashes with you because you have a little more internal cold. So in that case, you would want to pay special attention to tonifying that yang and that warmth, cultivating that warmth within your body during the winter. you might find if there's a certain season where you feel really good, then that might tell you also that, I feel really good in the winter because internally I'm pretty warm. Okay, so that would tell you a little bit about whether hot or cold. And maybe, if damp weather seems to aggravate you, that might say you have a little more internal damp. Okay. Um, and vice versa with dry. So, internal energy, third, seasonal foods. You really can't go too wrong if you eat just seasonally throughout the year. The reason for doing broth as opposed to say raw food or cooked food or certain other things is that broth is very easy to digest. Your body absorbs it quickly. Surface area is very little because it's liquid. But um, seasonal foods are going to have the highest nutrition. They're going to have the greatest, probably the best flavor, and they're going to be usually cheaper. So it's hard to go wrong. Okay. Um, and fourth, if you have a particular broth you like, you could ask, could I add something to this broth, to this soup that would acclimate it more to the season I'm in? If I really like to make chicken soup, can I add something to my chicken soup that might make it more warm or more cool, that might give it some of the qualities that relate it more to the season? Okay. Um, so those four things then, environment of the season, internal energy, your internal condition, that is, what are the seasonal foods for that time of the year? What can I do to enhance a broth I already like and make it more seasonal? Okay. Now, if you're not sure what the seasonal foods are, there's a uh, there's a website that you can look at. It's called seasonalfoodguide.org. And if you look at that site, there's a way that you can look at the state that you're in and the time of the year. And it will tell you what uh, what seasonal foods are there for that time that you're looking at. So you can look at the month of March and you can look at, say, early March, and it'll tell you early March has these foods. And different times of the year, you can find out what's seasonal in your area. It's a very nice tool to have. Okay, so in addition, we can talk a little bit about some of the additives that you could put in different broths during different times of the year. And opinions on this can vary. So I found different sources that suggest different things. So I'm just going to name a few of them that are suggested generally for these different seasons. And bear in mind, this is not all the seasonal foods, but these are things you might consider adding to a broth, to a soup, to a congee is kind of like a hearty soup that has a little more rice or grain in it. So in the spring, for example, since we know that spring is kind of a little bit warmer time of the year, starting to warm up, and it's starting to be wet. You're starting to get some more rain. Then you want cooling foods generally. Now, if it's a drier spring, you might want a little more sweet foods because they tend to moisten. And if it's a little more moist spring, you might want something a little more spicy. You might want something a little more pungent because those tend to disperse damp, disperse wetness. Okay, so spring, some suggestions for cooling, sweetish, or cooling spicy foods would be spinach, celery, onions, lettuce, mustard leaves, dates, wheat, peanuts, coriander, bamboo shoots, mushrooms, that kind of thing. Okay, now when you get into the summer, it's a hotter time of the year, and it might be more drying on your system. So you're going to tend to try to go for cold, sweet, or moisture producing, hydrating foods, and maybe sometimes bitter foods because bitter tends to cool you down. Okay. So some examples there would be bitter gourd or wax gourd, watermelons, peaches, strawberries, tomatoes, mung beans, cucumber, pumpkin, lotus root, lotus seeds, pearl barley, these kind of things. Now, you might not use all of those things regularly, but you get the idea. A lot of them are kind of sweet and wet, and some of them are bitter, and some of them are a little bit more like cool in their nature, like the cucumber, hence the saying. So when you are looking at a summer broth, a lot of times it might not be a hot broth, it might be a cold soup. And that's something we don't do an awfully lot of here, but it is something that people do in Chinese culture. They do cool cold soups sometimes. All right, then we have fall. In fall, of course, it's cooling down and it's getting drier, so we want things that are going to warm us up a little bit. And this is where you might have some more neutral or more sour type of foods because sour tends to astringe. You know how when you have lemon juice in your mouth, it kind of makes your mouth water and it makes you kind of pucker. That watering quality is what we're trying to produce internally. So that's why you might do a sour food in order to moisten internally. Okay. Sour foods, warming foods, neutral foods. Okay. Sesame might be there. You might put in things that are a little sweeter too, honey or pears or apples. You might do white fungus. You might do, a little bit more of that lemon. You might do some other things that are a little more on the sour side, some maybe high vitamin C type stuff, cherries or kiwis or that kind of thing. This could be a warm or a cool. You might also do some sour kind of herbs, and these are going to be um, warming neutral type things. And finally, winter, hot, warm type foods tend to be maybe saltier foods, tend to be heavier, a little fattier, because we're trying to hibernate, we're trying to store. Okay. Where most people kind of lament putting on that 5 pounds or whatever they put on during the holidays, that's actually kind of a normal thing for the natural order to put weight on during the winter because you're not moving as much and you're eating heavier stuff. Okay. Um, but since winter is cold and since winter tends to be moist, you're eating hot and warm type foods to disperse that cold. You're eating things that are a little bit heavier because they tend to make you warmer internally. And you're eating things that are saltier because that tends to help you. It helps you move fluid a little bit more through your body, and it helps you to not retain fluid as much. Okay. Also tends to help the kidney channel. So red meat, mutton, goose, duck, fatty meats like that, Chinese yam, glutinous rice, dates, eggs, black fungus, black, dark colored things in general, dark colored foods, beans, for example, black beans, red beans, that kind of thing. Leeks, onions, nuts, stuff like that. I'd say garlic would fall into that category. So, if you want to look up some kind of interesting seasonal soups, I would suggest that you go to a site called adailyfood.com and /soup and kanji. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen so that you can see this thing. Share. Window. Okay, so I'm sharing the screen now, and what you can see is this is the adailyfood.com soup and kanji page. And you can see there's several soups, and if you click on them, they'll have a recipe for it. So red bean soup, tangerine peel, it kind of talks here about how that tangerine peel tends to help your digestive process and helps your intestines, and so do the beans. And the beans also tend to um, help have other dietary uses. So that kind of sweet and sour type of flavor, kind of citrusy. It tends to make have these following benefits here. It reduces swelling, reduces fluid accumulation, helps the stomach and the spleen, which can also be pancreas, helps to detoxify, relieves pain, all of these different things. So I would tend to say that this type of a soup would be pretty good in the fall or fall transitioning into the winter. And there are several other soups here. You can see the fungus soup with the red dates, the pork soup, beef and radish. And this is another point that I'd like to make is that when you're making a broth in that thought process and that Eastern Eastern cuisine, usually you're going to have some kind of a meat on the bone, or you might have something that has collagen in it, something like uh, a chicken feet or pork feet or something that has skin on it and usually has the bone in it. And if you were going to make the broth, so fundamentally, you're making kind of a bone broth that has gelatin in it and maybe collagen in it. And then you're adding different flavors to it in order to enhance the seasonality of it. Okay. So, the broth that I made today, for example, for the cold and kind of dry weather today, had had green onions, it had garlic, it had ginger. Some of you might recognize that's a very good soup that I recommend to people for when they have a cold. Okay. And then add to that, I added radishes and I added carrots and I put it in a turkey bone broth. Okay. So turkey broth, I figured was a good substitute for maybe the goose or the duck part of it because it tends to be a little bit fattier and it's more of a seasonal meat. Okay. So you tend to do the heavier meats here during the winter, and then the lighter things, your chicken or your fish or things that are lower in fat, you would tend to do more in the summer or even in the spring, towards the late spring. So that was my recommendation for this time of the year. And then to that, you would add whatever flavor, whatever things you wanted to add that would be seasonal, that would make it good, whatever kind of meat you wanted to have. Or if you didn't want to have meat, you might put some kind of beans in it, make maybe a chili with it, that kind of a thing. Okay. So, if you have questions, comments, please let me know. I just wanted to share that information about broth, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation, and I hope that I'll see you at the next Lunch and Learn in 2025. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I'll see you soon.